Perhaps you can hear outside my window that the rain is falling very hard in Paris right now, which is quite a coincidence because I'm about to be talking about when the rain really floods Paris over. Yes, every year there's a lot of rain in the city, and sometimes the Seine River rises even a little tiny bit, imperceptibly. A couple times in the past decade, the Seine has truly flooded over and made world headlines. But the one flood to rule them all was 1910, when the water reached so high that life as everyone knew it in the modern city of Paris changed seemingly forever. This is an episode about the floods of Paris. You're going to hear the voice of Pres Maxson, who wrote a book called Paris Underwater: How the City of Lights Survived the Great Flood of 1910. And you're going to hear a little bit about how to do your own scavenger hunt to find the markers and the traces of this enormous flood from over 100 years ago in this city. My name is Oliver G. This is the Eiffel Tower podcast, and F is for flood. Now, excuse me while I find some shelter from the storm. Here comes some music from Pres Maxson. So, as I said, there was some music from Pres Maxson. He says F is for flood, but F is also for frérot, as in the French singer Jeremy Frérot, whose song Sous l'eau, which means underwater, I recorded for this week's podcast. He is one half of the duo from Frérot de la Vega, who gained fame on the French version of The Voice. I love the lyrics here that remind me of our Paris floods, with lines like, "Underwater in this submerged world, what can emerge?" Side note, this is Oliver speaking now. A lot can emerge. We'll get back to that in a second. Pres continues, and lyrics like, "People keep me afloat. When will the rising waters come?" I also dug the little synth arpeggio in the background that underpins the whole song, giving it a swelling feeling. And obviously, I changed the key from the original recording to F. So, Pres Maxson, the maestro, does it again, gives us a little sense of what's ahead. Like I said in the intro, you're going to hear from Pres Maxson talking about his book. But first, I just want to talk about the floods from my own perspective. I find it hugely interesting when the Seine River floods over. And as I said, twice since I've been living here, there's been decent floods. Once, I remember the first time it happened, and I was down there like every single day, fascinated by how this background river was taking center stage. Something, the Seine is so easy to sort of, take for granted. Often when you're taking pictures or walking along it, you're framing the city with the Seine. You're not really focusing on the Seine. You're not taking pictures of just the Seine. It's more about the whole picture. And then suddenly, the Seine is the main attraction. And it's one of those, like, it's a natural disaster, but no one's getting injured or killed. So you can sort of be fascinated by it in a whole different way to, an earthquake or something like that, which is this big national or international tragedy. The flood, there's something about it, and I've always loved it. So I wanted to dig deeper for this episode. Also, I'm always marveling when I stumble upon one of these flood markers. And I'll talk about it a little bit with Jeffrey, but the idea is there's a vertical line that says 1910, and you can find it all over the city in the most unexpected places. Most recently, I was in the Conciergerie, where Marie Antoinette went to prison, and the flood markers in that main hall are higher than my head, because it's right by the river. Now, that is frightening. The water, this isn't just where the water would have got up to. This is where the water hit. You can see where the stones have been discolored. Also in various districts, in the 6th, in the 5th, I've seen it in the 4th, on the Ile Saint-Louis even, and in the 12th. I've seen some recently in the 12th where I live. I'll share a picture on social media of one I found today that's about my shoulder height. So it's really confusing to think about the floods, especially this great flood, because it doesn't just raise the sort of water level to the exact same level all over town, because obviously it's not a flat city and it's going through different tunnels and subway systems and sewer systems, so it's hard to kind of get an idea of just how crazy it is. But that's what we try and talk about in the podcast. But we'll talk about it a little bit in the podcast. As I said, check out social media. I'll be sharing all sorts of pictures from the floods in 1910, my own pictures of the floods from more recently, and pictures of the flood markers. But for now, I want to introduce you to Jeffrey Jackson, who's a professor of history at Rhodes College in the States. And I'll talk a bit more about how you can find him and his book at the end of the episode. Pres, a little more music, I think. Jeffrey Jackson, it seems to me that you love Paris and France. How did that come to be?
Well, I've visited Paris for a long time, but even before I started to go to Paris, I heard stories about Paris from my grandparents. My grandparents were world travelers. They went everywhere. Once they retired, they just started traveling all over the world, and they went to Europe many times and brought back amazing stories and photographs from Paris and elsewhere. And it really excited my imagination. And also, when I was in elementary school, I took French as a foreign language. And so for me, hearing their stories and then studying the language kind of really steered me towards France as a subject. And then when I decided that I wanted to go to graduate school and become a historian, it seemed natural to start studying France.
And your grandparents, do you know how early their earliest visit was to Paris? 1910, perhaps?
Not quite that early. They started traveling in the mid-'70s, and I don't know exactly when their first visit to Paris was, but it was probably sometime in the mid to late 70s, I would say.
You never know. I was hoping you had really old grandparents. But the reason I say 1910, of course, is because this is when the Great Flood of Paris happened. You eventually made it to Paris. Something made it click that you wanted to know more about it. Walk me through it. What made the floods a subject for you?
So I had already published one book, my book about the reception of jazz music in Paris in the 20s and 30s, and I was looking for a new project. And I went to Paris, and this was in the summer of 2005. I went with my then girlfriend, but we were going to get engaged. We knew we wanted to get engaged in Paris and be romantic about it. And so we ended up getting engaged at the Eiffel Tower. But before we did, we had this sort of funny thought that maybe we would go on the tour of the Paris sewers, and then we would get engaged in the sewers, and we thought that might be a funny engagement story. So when we took the tour of the sewers, which you can still do to this day, at the end of the tour, there was a series of photographs. And one of those photographs is sort of the history of the sewers in photographs. And one of those photographs was a photograph of the flood. And at that point, having written a book about Paris and having read and studied and visited Paris, I had never heard of the flood. I didn't know anything about it. And so I kind of tucked it in the back of my mind, and I thought, one day that might be an interesting project to work on. And that was the summer of 2005. And then the fall or August of 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit the United States and the Gulf Coast region, which is not very far from where I live. And of course, watching Hurricane Katrina on television and then having some of my students' families affected by that, they had to go home and help their families. And we had students from New Orleans who actually came to our campus and continued their schooling while that was going on. All of that made me think back to that flood photograph that I had seen in the sewers. And I said, no, this is a project I need to be working on now. This is the next project because of everything that was going on in our world. And it led me into not only thinking about the Paris flood, but also disasters more generally. There's a whole body of scholarship on disaster studies. And I've now been teaching a course on that, actually, for a number of years.
So you've got this... It's funny, not many romantic stories are involved with the Paris sewers. I like that. So you're on this romantic trip. You see the sewers. You're like, I want to work on the flood. And at the time, even today, there's not much has been, especially not in English. There's not much has been written about the floods. But thank goodness there are a bunch of old photos. Was that sort of where you started? Did you dig into those old pictures?
Absolutely. I mean, that photo in the sewer was the first photo that I saw. But I began to look for others. One of the first things you do when you start a research project is you start to look and see, what's out there, what you can find. And I knew I would need to go to the archives, and I did spend a lot of time in the Parisian archives, working and on the documents, government documents, hospital records, all sorts of things related to this. But the things that I could access most easily were photographs, because there are hundreds and hundreds of photographs. What happened was that even while the water was still high, photographers were going all over the city, taking photographs, and then those photographs were being printed on postcards and sold to Parisians even while the water was still high. So even as the flood was going on, people could see photographs of the flood itself. So there are hundreds of these photographs, and they're still around today. You can find them on the web. You can find them, some of them have been reprinted in books. I have some on my website. I went to the flea market in Paris and bought several, and I've acquired more over the years. But that one time I was in a restaurant and I looked up, this was a restaurant near the river, and I looked up and there was a framed photograph of the flood, because that neighborhood, that street, would have been flooded during the 1910 flood. If people know about the flood at all, that's probably how they know it. They know it through the photographs, because those photographs, they're so dramatic, and they're sort of amazing, and it makes the city look strange and eerie, and unexpected. And so I think that's part of what the attraction to those photos is.
That must have been really, I can imagine, that must have been really exciting for you when you got your project and you want to find more about it, and there's an untold number of these angles of these photos where you can see what you're researching, and then you go to the flea markets and you're like, I got to find the flood pictures, and the excitement, I imagine, of finding them must have been really special. But I want, can you put it into perspective? You, the expert, people listening, and they're thinking, okay, flood. I've heard of floods before. How bad was this flood?
Well, it was the second worst flood in the city's history. The only worst flood was in 1658, when the water was really just a few centimeters higher than it was in 1910. Although it's hard to compare, those two floods, because the city was so different in 1910. If you look at the maps of the flood, you see that all of the areas along the banks, of course, of the river, so right through the heart of the city, everything was flooded. But even neighborhoods that were far away from the river also were flooded. Because one of the things that happens is that the water never comes over the banks of the river. The water actually comes up from below. It comes up from the sewers, and it comes up from the metro, which was under construction at that time. In fact, one of the most dramatic stories that I often tell is that the metro line, what is now Metro Line 12, water entered on the left bank near the Orsay. It went through the tunnel, the metro tunnel, under the banks, or under the Seine itself, but it came up on the right bank. So it went from left bank to right bank underneath the channel of the river itself in the metro line. So up around Gare Saint-Lazare. So
that's frightening.
It is frightening. And there are also old branches of the river and other rivers that are connected to the Seine that have since been buried for centuries. Those rivers started to reactivate and to come back. So areas that were, a long way from the river, actually found water in their basements and in the streets. The streets were torn up in many places. Buildings, there are some great photographs that show some of that destruction, water shooting out from the sewers, big chunks of buildings torn off by the force of the water. Sometimes people would go into their basement, they would see water in the basement, and there was a drain plug frequently. And that drain plug would go into the sewer. And so they thought, if I pull the drain plug, I'll let this water drain into the sewer. But what they didn't realize is that the water was coming up from the sewer. So when they pulled the drain plug, they were just allowing more water into their homes.
And how bad was it for the city? I mean, were people dying? Were things damaged beyond repair? Was it was it? It's easy to think that it might have just been a good old, much-needed wash in the 1910s, but I can imagine that it was worse than that.
It was pretty destructive for certain sections of the city. It had a big economic effect. All of the warehouses in the Bercy neighborhood, including the wine warehouses where all the wine would come in. All of that product was destroyed. Wine barrels were floating down the river. People were trying to fish them out. So a lot of people, jobs were affected. Property was affected, certainly. Livelihood, loss of wages, loss of property. Everything, of course, is repaired. I mean, Paris is still there, right? It didn't get washed away. But there was a moment, I think, for a lot of people where it was unclear, what was going to happen, because this was not the way that people were used to seeing the city. Paris at the turn of the century talked about itself as the most modern city in the world. They had a World's Fair, a Universal Exposition in 1900 to celebrate once again the modernity of the city. And so there was this real expectation that science, engineering, technology, we could control everything. And so when the water comes up, it doesn't kill huge numbers of people. It's really hard to come to a death toll, but it's not a very large number. But it's, hundreds of millions of francs at the time in damages. But it really is, I think, more of a psychic shock to the city. I think a lot of people are really sort of amazed that the city could undergo this level of devastation at a time when people really felt like we could control nature. We really could, shape our urban environment to our own needs.
The one thing that's always for sure is never turn your back on Mother Nature, never turn your back on the tide. And it seems like that's kind of what happened. Personally, when I've seen the Seine flood 2 or 3 times in recent years, obviously nowhere near as bad, but still enough to take notice. I'm sure you remember a couple years ago when they were, that they were like closing parts of the Louvre because they were afraid that the basements were going to flood. It's this fascinating thing. And even then, the tourists and locals are lining up to see this because, the Seine is this passive background of Paris that everybody loves, this calm thing that's just there, and then suddenly it's the star of the show and no one knows what's going to happen. If it's fascinating now, I just can't even imagine how much people were getting into it at the time. Did it have long-standing effects on Paris? Less so about the finances and stuff, but did it make changes to the city, the way people acted to each other or the way people lived?
At the time, it certainly did. I mean, I think one of the things that when you study enough disasters, and as I said, I've been studying other disasters too that came out of this research, you learn that there's a very common phenomenon that happens in the wake of disaster. And it's often referred to as disaster utopianism. And it's this moment where in the wake of any kind of natural disaster, people really come together and they rally and they help each other. And that's certainly what happened in this moment. I mean, people were, as you say, they were out looking at the river. They were standing along the banks. They were gawking and they couldn't believe what was happening. But they were also helping each other, the military, police, but also just ordinary citizens were out in the streets. They were assisting one another, rescuing people, ladders going up to windows to take people out, boats floating through the street, ferrying people from one side of a flooded street to another. People would put out wooden walkways. They would take maybe tables out of their workshop and create a wooden walkway. A lot of people started to compare it to Venice. They said it looks like Venice during the Acqua Alta, the high water that happens every year in Venice. And so there really was this kind of sense of people working together and rallying together. And that was especially surprising for a lot of people, I think, at the time, because, and I don't have time to go into all the details, but France was very polarized at this moment, politically polarized, religious politics, right and left. There's a kind of already the beginnings of kind of proto-fascism that's happening in this around the turn of the century. So there's a lot of social change. There's a lot of dramatic transformation of not just of the city, but of society. The Dreyfus Affair, of course, is the most dramatic polarization that it had only just sort of come to a conclusion in many ways. So it was almost sort of unexpected that people would rally to each other because it seemed like people were so pulled apart by the politics and the passions of the day. And so I think there's that kind of moment, that realization that, hey, we can actually work together. We are still unified. And I think that would be really important. That would become really important when you think about the timing. It's only 4 years later. It's the outbreak of World War I. And I think that sense of unity and that sense of togetherness was almost like, I talk about it in the book, it's almost like a kind of a dry run or a test run for what would happen in World War I. Because the same thing, people in World War I in France rallied together as nations often do during war, and this kind of sense of national unity. But Parisians had already gone through that in 1910.
What did you call it again? Was it a disaster utopia? What did you call it again?
Disaster utopianism.
Wow, I love it. Interesting. What a thought. I want to talk about, and time slips away so quickly, but I want to talk about the Zouave, I think it's pronounced the Zouave statue, because nowadays people use this statue as a sort of measure of how high the water is getting, and this is a statue down by near the Eiffel Tower. Sometimes these days it tickles his feet, it goes up to his knees, but it wasn't like that. Have you seen of course you've seen the pictures, but how high did it get on him in 1910?
In 1910, it was up to his neck. And I talk about in the book, it's sort of a fitting metaphor for how many people in the city felt, that the water was up to their neck. And a lot of people felt like it wouldn't take much more to for the city to drown. And so people went to look at the Zouave. There are lots of photographs, lots of postcards of that image. I have at least one on my website, I think. And for a lot of people, that really was it was even then the measure of the depth of the water, but also I think again a kind of a psychological sense of how much danger the city was in.
You mentioned these postcards. We talked about it a bit before. Because I like these, I've bought a bunch of these old postcards around Paris, and I got a handful of the ones at the flood too. And I remember asking one of the guys, like at the Bouquiniste in Paris, I was like, why do the postcards have so little written on the back? Sometimes it just says like 3 words or something. And he told me, and I don't know if it's true, maybe but he told me that often they'd use a postcard to just say, I tried to find you at the hotel, you weren't there, and they'd leave it at the concierge or something. It was like a sort of a text messaging service almost. Is that because they didn't even need stamps or anything? They're just a little, I was here, or I'm waiting for you. Is that what they were used for? I mean, is that why they were so popular? Is that?
I think they were used for a lot of things. I mean, partly that. What you're describing is almost like a calling card or something, just a sort of like a quick message, or like you say, kind of like a text. Some of them, I've seen postcards, and I own some that were, where people did write a long message. It's kind of like, often it was something like, I can't believe what's happening in Paris. Look at the. But the other thing that people use postcards for, they collected them. So I've got many postcards that have nothing written on them at all. And they're completely flat. They never went through the mail service or the post. They were intended to be collected. And in fact, that period in the late 19th, early 20th century is often referred to by postcard collectors as the golden age of postcards. Because that was really when they started to come out. They were mass produced in large numbers. These international expositions, these world's fairs, people would collect them as souvenirs. And so I think for a lot of people, they were also just a souvenir of this event, because it was such a remarkable and amazing spectacle that they'd never seen their city that way before. And so you could collect the postcards and almost kind of take a tour, so to speak. You could flip through the postcards and take a tour of what the city looked like, various neighborhoods in this very strange and altered and flooded state.
And that brings us to today quite nicely, because firstly, those old 100-year-old postcards are one of the, as far as I'm concerned, one of the best souvenirs to get from Paris, because you can get some ancient history, cool picture, maybe just for €1, fits in your suitcase on the way home. Right. Way better than getting some, little trinket or whatever, or a macaron that's going to melt or whatever. But also today, something I really love is the treasure hunt of sorts, scavenger hunt that comes with this flood. And that's the really odd collection of sort of markers they've put around the town saying how high the water is. Did you go on the scavenger hunt trying to find them? Did you find any in unusual places? Do you still look for them when you come to Paris?
I do, actually. I know where some of them are, but I also look to see, when I'm walking by the river, because often, you're right, you look down in the river channel, and sometimes you'll just see a line and it says 1910. And I might have seen those before I wrote this book and just not knew what it was. You know, I just thought it was something navigational for boats or something. But now that I know what it is, I always look for them. And you find them in certain neighborhoods. I've seen them, you know, there's one, I have a photograph on the website. I often show it. It's over near the Orsay, actually, and it's on the doorframe of an apartment building. And it shows, I believe it's Rue de Bellechasse. And and it shows the line, and it's still there. I was in Paris a couple of years ago, and we happened to go to that neighborhood, and there it was. It was still there. But you find them in other neighborhoods too. Sometimes just wandering around. I remember just seeing random, you know, one over by the Institut de France, I think, years ago. And so it is a little bit of a scavenger hunt, and it's one of the few ways that the flood is actually commemorated. There's no monument, there's no, you know, other official commemoration in the cityscape. So you get these markers, and then you get the postcards, but there's no other, you know, sort of way that the story is told, except, you know, through histories like mine, or through, you know, other kinds of maybe websites or places where you can encounter elements of that story, or podcasts like this one. But the city hasn't created any kind of monument or marker or anything.
Not yet, at least. And maybe if they're listening to me and you chatting, Jeffrey, it will be the next thing that the town hall decides to do, although I doubt it. But you never know. Jeffrey, thanks so much for sharing your voice with us here on the Eiffel Tower.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me.
Now there you have it. As the water continues to pour against my own rooftop, I wonder if we're due for another flood. Probably. That was Jeffrey H. Jackson. As I said, you can find him jeffreyhjackson.com, where you can find a lot more about his books. I'll be linking it in the show notes as well. His new book, Paper Bullets. Otherwise, you can find Paris Underwater and Making Jazz French online anywhere that you look for them. This has been an episode of the Eiffel Tower's AB season. Thanks to all the Patreon members who literally make this show run. No ads, as you probably noticed. The next 2 episodes, I haven't given any clues. Look, people have been writing in saying, I can't find the clues. In the previous episode, I just gently used the word flood in a really unexpected way. It didn't even fit. And same with in the episode about Deauville. I tried to say, I said something like, this town was built 20 years after the Eiffel Tower was built, as a clue for the Eiffel Tower. In this episode, there's been no clues about the next one, but I will tell you this. Both G and H are going to be architecture related. Good luck figuring that out. I'll be back with another episode on Monday, as always, and thanks for listening to the show. Au revoir.